Alright guys, welcome back. We are up to APUSH topic 5.7, election of 1860 and secession. So, the election of 1860 is arguably the most important election in all of American history because, of course, this is the one that's going to tip the balance towards civil war. So let's try to get into some details and figure out why this election is so important and its effects. So let's look at the causes and effects of Abraham Lincoln's 1860 election. Now, before we get to the 1860 election, we need to talk about an earlier election that is going to give rise to what's known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So if you recall, the little giant, Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, was a senator. In fact, he's running for re-election in 1858, and he's being challenged by a Republican from Illinois, a well-known lawyer, and had served in the House of Representatives for 1 term back in the 1840s. His name is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. So let's get into this senatorial election. Now, if you recall, back in this time period, senators were chosen not by individual voters, but by state legislature. Nonetheless, they're going to have an election campaign. And what Lincoln does is he challenges Douglas to a series of debates across the state, because as a newcomer, as a challenger, you need to do something to kind of break the momentum of the incumbent. And so he's going to try to, outdo Douglas on the debate stage. Now, we don't need to go through all the ins and outs of this, except to say that during the course of these debates, Lincoln does a pretty good job of kind of outwitting Douglas, or at least kind of maneuvering him into doing things he probably wouldn't want to do. And this would include what's known as the Freeport Doctrine. This takes place in Freeport, Illinois, during one of these debates. And basically, Lincoln knows that this whole Kansas-Nebraska Act, which Douglas had cooked up, was extremely unpopular with a lot of people in the North, and he's trying to tap into that. So what he does is he challenges Douglas. He says, okay, so which one do you favor? Do you favor popular sovereignty, which is, kind of the key of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or do you favor the Dred Scott decision? Because you really can't favor both, because Dred Scott had basically said that slavery can be extended into any territory. It doesn't matter what the people say. So popular sovereignty or Dred Scott, which one do you favor the most? And he knows that no matter which side he chooses, Douglas is going to really tick off a lot of voters. And in the end, what Douglas does is he ends up having to support popular sovereignty. And, and Dred Scott is kind of left by the wayside. Now, this is something that's going to cause a lot of Southerners who are observing this to be furious with Douglas, and they're not going to even consider voting for him when it comes for the 1860 presidential election. Now, in terms of who wins the election in the Illinois, for the Illinois Senate seat, of course, that is Stephen Douglas, not Lincoln. Lincoln doesn't win this, guys. But you can argue that even in defeat, he won, because what happens is Lincoln has made a name for himself across the country. Douglas has really politically handicapped himself by having to not defend the Dred Scott decision fully and by supporting popular sovereignty. And so the South is furious about that. Which brings us to the election of 1860. So, in our last video, I was talking about how the northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party are definitely heading in different directions. And by 1860, it's official. There are two Democratic parties. There's the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And the Northerners are going to nominate Stephen A. Douglas and put forth a plan of, once again supporting popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats, however, are going to pick as their nominee the current Vice President, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. And his plan was to expand slavery into the territories. Now, not everybody in the South, however, was ready to call it quits with the Union. And so into this steps a new political party called the Constitutional Union Party, which basically sounds like a party of compromise, because that's what it was. and they were pretty popular in the so-called border states. So places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, places where slavery may legally exist, but it wasn't necessarily the dominant political and economic arrangement. And they're going to choose a Tennessean named John Bell to be their nominee. And then there's the Republican Party. If you recall, they had basically run for their first time in 1856 under John C. Fremont, had done pretty well, but had lost to James Buchanan. But this time around, they sense victory because they know the Democratic Party is divided north and south. And they know Lincoln, their nominee, has a big following in the north. Now, they chose Lincoln, even though the most famous Republican of the era was William Seward, because William Seward was a guy who had, frankly made a lot of enemies because he was not willing to compromise on anything. And Lincoln is a man who seems to be a guy who can, bring people together, unlike Seward. But what's the platform of the Republicans? Well, they want to make sure that slavery does not extend any further than where it's at. So this will appeal to free soilers. They want to increase the tariff to protect northern industries. So northern manufacturers, they're going to like that. They wanted to hand out free homesteads out in the West. This would appeal to farmers. They also wanted to build the so-called Pacific Railroad, which is the transcontinental railroad. What's missing, of course, in all of this platform is a call for abolition. There is no call for the end of slavery. Let's look at some of the political cartoons here from 1860. You've got all four candidates. We've got Breckinridge, Bell, we have Stephen Douglas, and Abraham Lincoln, all kind of fighting for different parts of the country. Here we have all four candidates again. There's Dred Scott in the center. Here they are playing baseball, doing some sort of circus routine, I guess, juggling, and racing, literally, a political race. Lincoln's out in front. Well, the reaction from the South was, if you elect Lincoln, we're going to break away, so don't dare elect Lincoln. And this is, again, something that the South had been thrown out there. They'd done the same thing in 1856, 1848, this idea that if you dare elect someone we don't like, we're out of here kind of thing. And in fact, if you were in the South, you couldn't vote for Lincoln if you wanted to, because in 10 southern states, he wasn't even on the ballot. Well, let's look at the results. As we all know, Abraham Lincoln is going to win. The fact that he wasn't on the ballot in 10 southern states is not enough to keep him out of the White House. The northern and southern Democrats here, you can see they split. And even if you add those two together, they're still not as strong as Abraham Lincoln. And John Bell actually does better than Stephen Douglas. And there's the results. Now, if you look at the popular vote, guys, you'll notice that Lincoln gets 40% of the popular vote, which means 60% of all Americans voted for someone other than Lincoln. So Lincoln is certainly a guy that's going to enter office with a lot of people across this country not liking him very much. Here it is by county. You can see Bell, a lot of popularity here in the middle, in the kind of the buffer states, and Lincoln taking the North. Now, this leads to the secession of South Carolina. So recall, Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. He won't be sworn in until March of 1861. But South Carolina is not even going to wait around for that to happen. They go ahead and secede. And frankly, they look pretty ecstatic about this. They've been looking for an excuse to secede, and now they have it. After South Carolina, 6 states in the lower South then also join up. So you've got pretty much all these blue states here all seceding. What's the reaction to this? Or why are they doing this? Part of this is the fact that the Republican Party was a northern-only party, and they had elected Lincoln without even getting any southern votes. And the South looks at this and they're frantic that this could happen every single election. That from here on out, it'll just be northern president, northern president, northern president. They're tired of northern interference in slavery and criticism of slavery. They also feel kind of like they have a destiny here, that they're going to win. that they're going to be their own country. For them, they see this as the Second American Revolution, and they're like George Washington all over again. They're also confident that the South won't actually fight back, and they won't oppose Southern secession, that the North will just simply let them go because they don't want to fight over it. And so the seceding states form their own government. We call this the Confederate States of America. Its original capital was Montgomery, Alabama, and their first and only president would be one Jefferson Davis of Kentucky. A little bit of irony here is that Davis and Lincoln were both born in Kentucky. In fact, their hometowns are only a short distance away from each other. All right, guys. So we now have 1860 under our belt. We've got secession going on. So now, of course, it is finally time for the American Civil War, which we'll explore in the next couple of videos.